say send some questions. They will appear on the screen on the right.
Bonjour à tous. Donc nous allons reprendre.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to pick up this session now. We are here in Paris, and we also have some remote participants. I'd like to thank all of the participants who are here in Paris or in Brussels or in the USA. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's session. I'd like to move on now to panel 4, which is a subject which has been long discussed, which is about crypto assets. The moderator is Mr. Nicolas Arpagnon. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us for this session, which is going to be an hour and a half long. We are going to have an exchange of views on the two sides of the Atlantic, because we have with us, we have a panel as one of our panelists. We have the deputy Joint Public Prosecutor from the United States, from the Department of Justice. You're on the East Coast. Thank you very much for being available to us at this early hour. On my right, I have Mr. Nicolas Louvet, who is the chairman of Coin House. He's co-founder of Coin House, and that company does actually try to attract a business into crypto assets, and so they're very much stakeholders in the private sector. Next to him we have Harold Weiglein, who is the Director General in the Austrian Treasury. Thank you very much for joining us today, Director. And then next to him we have Thomas Ricoltofi, who's Director of the Fight Against Financial Crime in the Judicial Police. And then finally online with us today we have the MEP Ernest Urtasun, who is a Spanish member of the European Parliament. So thank you all. Thank you for attending today's discussion. The idea is that during this panel discussion we're able to have a good focused discussion on the threats that we have identified concerning crypto assets and the role that Europe could play in supervising or monitoring this activity. We have seen that the criminal world is concerned by the discussion that we had earlier on, but here we have a civil presence and a civil activity, the financial activity of crypto assets, developing a new environment. But this new environment is actually also being used by criminals, and so I think we've got to look and see what characteristics of the crypto assets would open the door for criminal activity, and how should it be supervised and framed to prevent that. Now, to start, and perhaps to better place us, depending on what your function or your activity is. Perhaps you have responsibility for crypto assets already, but just to set the discussion within its frameworks, we need to understand what exactly we're talking about. We've got the technical tool, we've got the crypto assets themselves, but how are they dealt with? How are they used? How do they circulate? Let's start perhaps by giving the floor, I wouldn't say to the defendant, but I think you're going to have a more positive approach to cryptocurrency. So let me turn first of all to Nicolas Louvet from Coin House. Good afternoon, Nicolas. Well, to respond to your question, yes, indeed, I have a more positive view on crypto assets, cryptocurrencies. Indeed, I believe that these are investment funds, the investment currency. It's a new type, a new tool, a new support, enabling us to vehicle value, to transport value. It can be linked to the bitcoins or to other digital currencies. It has unique value, what we call the NFTs. It can also be a title, an ownership title. So It's a real innovation in technological terms, and indeed we can actually see circulating a new value. We talk about stable coin, for example. So it's a good opportunity, it's a new opportunity for us in the field of financing, and it does indeed entail a number of risks once you actually start dealing with a phenomenon where we're part of the financial markets, where there's an interaction with the monetary and financial systems as they traditionally exist. So I imagine that's what we'll be looking at, this interface. But it's a new opportunity, it's a new media, it's a new support, it's a new tool. It's something which we will have to integrate sooner or later in the way in which our financial systems work. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, just to cover the financial area here, we have Mr. Weigling. Now, you're from the Treasury. We've seen the European Central Bank is actually concerned about what these crypto assets could be as vehicles for a currency. How do you deal with this? How do you see the crypto assets?
To crypto assets. On the one hand, there's the technological side that's just been explained. And here there is a new technology to use for also financial purposes that can be beneficial, but can also be abused. But if you look at the financial side, the financial characteristics of crypto assets aren't really all that new. They're the same as with any other financial instruments or financial assets. And to us, that means they should be dealt with as we deal with other financial assets, for instance, deposits, securities, ownership titles, whatever you have. So our approach to this is technological neutrality. And I think with the AML package that's on the table now that the Commission has put before us, we're taking a giant step that's very welcome because we've noticed also in Austria over the past years that these new tools are used by criminals, they're used by money laundering. In fact, during our presidency, just to give you one example, during the Austrian presidency in 2018, we had a study commissioned into virtual currencies. And we looked at the exchanges into real currencies from a sample of virtual assets. And the currencies that crop up there are not currencies that are normally known for being dominant in currency markets. Large parts of the transactions were in and out of the Russian ruble, for instance. And there were also parallels in the rise of the value of some of these currencies whenever there were large harvests in known drug markets or demand swings in drug markets. So these are fairly strong indications that a significant part of these assets or instruments are used for criminal activities. And we need to react to that and we need to deal with that. Otherwise, we open a loophole for potentially very dangerous activities. Maybe there's not just the criminal aspects, because we also know that some of the actors that we're dealing with here are more than criminal organizations, they're even states. If you look at what happened with the Central Bank of Bangladesh, it's fairly clear that there is a sovereign actor behind this. And for some of these people, that's a source of revenue also that they're trying to use.
Bien sûr, on reviendra sur les...
Yes, we will come back to the various threats, but just talking about the vehicle itself, you've said that it's more or less agnostic, that it's a technology, and then it's up to everyone to use it as they see fit. Now, let me turn to the public prosecutor in the USA. There is indeed a question of the volume and the number of actors who are involved in crypto assets. From your point of view, how do you deal with this area of activity?
Well, thank you very much. And like my colleagues here have discussed, since the very beginning of the first cryptocurrency going back to 2009, for example, the Department of Justice has witnessed the evolution of the growing role of crypto in our global economy, just as we've seen across the world and as my colleagues have discussed. On the one hand, we know that this technology a number of substantial benefits, both to consumers and to investors. And we've already heard from one of my colleagues here who works in this space on a day-to-day basis. Proponents encourage more widespread use and development of this new technology, along with investment, and they argue about how crypto presents tremendous potential for a decentralized but secure medium of exchange. But as my colleague in law enforcement described earlier, on the other hand, we know all too well that bad actors leverage this innovation, this decentralization, its anonymization to facilitate criminal conduct in all corners of the world right now. And those are the attributes, the same attributes that make crypto valuable for legitimate uses also make them attractive for criminals and money launderers. Makes them attractive to sanctioned nations and terrorists and others who are appropriately excluded already from our global financial system. And so as a result, what we are seeing is cryptocurrency used in a wide variety of criminal activity, just as you heard earlier, from being the primary demand mechanism for ransomware payments to money laundering and the operation of illegal or unregistered money services businesses, to being the preferred means of exchange of value on what are known as dark markets for illegal drugs or weapons or malware or other hacking tools. And so from the DOJ's perspective, what we've had to do is respond with a laser type focused on combating crypto-related crimes. Back in October of last year, our Deputy Attorney General announced the formation of a national cryptocurrency enforcement team, commonly referred to as INSET. We're using that task force to tackle complex investigations and prosecutions of criminal misuse of crypto. The department is also strengthening its capacity to dismantle the entities that enable criminal actors to flourish on these platforms. Going back to as early as 2018, the department established a digital currency initiative that specializes in these types of prosecutions, including the recovery of crypto-related assets. INSET builds on that digital currency initiative, and it will continue to focus again on crimes committed by exchanges, using mixing and tumbling services and money laundering infrastructure actors. It will also help us assist in tracing the recovery of assets lost to fraud and extortion. And again, in my capacity as the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, that INSET team will report directly to me.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Houlton, the French presidency of the EU has begun, so we can see that the European Union is going to be a logical starting point for global activity. I wonder if you could tell us how you see the issue of the crypto assets.
Alors, hop, a priori, nous n'entendons pas. Voilà, merci.
Maintenant, vous m'entendez bien maintenant,
Oui.
j'espère.
Can you hear me now?
Merci beaucoup et merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the French presidency for having invited me. If I may, and I apologize in advance, I'm going to speak in English, which is a little easier for me on this sort of subject.
I'd like to thank that firstly, well, for at EU level, I think that the crypto currencies offer good possibilities to strengthen our capital market unions, in the sense that, of course, those digital instruments are not limited by national borders by nature, and then it can help European Union markets for sure. But of course, those instruments are posing a certain number of increasing risks, and at EU level, of course, the legislation is not there yet in order to address all these risks. And of course, I mean, I'm talking, for instance, about the risk to consumer protection, to the lack of information and the lack of understanding of those instruments by our citizens when these crypto assets are being sold everywhere at the EU level. We are talking about the risk that, as we have been saying, that some of these crypto assets are based in a purely Ponzi scheme, that are then, of course, linked to a huge volatility in their value, and that can make a citizen lose very quickly their money. And then, as our colleagues from the United States was pointing out, I think that we are all aware that these cryptocurrencies are now more and more used for crypto criminals, and we have been witnessing that the illegal trading platforms of the darknet or the ransomware attacks now very much rely on cryptocurrencies. And then what we need to be aware is that the anti-money laundering rules are not there yet at EU level. So I think that the two things are going on at the EU level that are very relevant when it comes to legislation. First, you all are aware we are in the middle of the negotiation of the new regulation, which is called MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets, which is going to give powers for authorization and supervision also at EU level. And my group is advocating to have ESMA as a strong regulator and supervisor for this instrument. The entry into force of MiCA, which still will take a bit of time, will be an extremely important moment for the EU to regulate those crypto assets. And MiCA will also address a major growing concern when it comes to those instruments, which is its environmental impact. I think that the way some of this, the mining of those cryptocurrencies is working, and particularly the proof of work, is something that provokes greater and greater environmental concern, because, as you know, the mining in Bitcoin now consumes same amount of electricity as the whole Netherlands at the moment, according to the latest statistics, and this is really really problematic. So MiCA is going to be one important part of the legislature, and the second part, and I will end here, is the transfer of fund regulation, which basically we are going to recast the transfer of fund regulation, which now imposes customer due diligence into normal transactions to cryptocurrency transactions in order to impose a travel rule. So we are our FIUs are more able to track criminal activity. So those two issues are going to be very relevant, and from a legislative point of view, I think that they are going to create a new legislative framework at EU level when it comes to cryptocurrencies. Thank you.
Merci. Alors,
Thank you very much. Well, to wrap up this round of table, we have our last colleague. Now, from your point of view, perhaps you could tell us how you see this tool.
les cryptoactifs ont...
Well, crypto assets have been adopted very quickly by criminal groups. They're always very quick to use new technology, as are the police, in fact. So why are criminals interested, but why do they want to use crypto assets? Well, criminal gangs aim to make money, and make money quickly. And they want to finance their criminal activities. So organized crime wants to use financial crime, and any type of financial crime. Crime is also becoming more and more digital, and so criminals are turning to digital products more and more. So online banking, virtual IBAN numbers, encrypted telephone numbers, using the dark web, deep fakes. Organized crime is adapting, is using crypto assets and using digitization. And that creates a distance between the authorities, the victim, and the perpetrator. And that's going to make the investigation more difficult, where you have physical contact between the perpetrator and the victim. Crypto assets also serve a number of purposes for criminal groups. The most obvious is embezzlement, false investments in crypto assets, a fake platform selling a product. That's a product that's developed a lot over the last few years, with big variations in value, and it's attracting investors. Criminal groups will also try and capture crypto assets that people really own. So you have things called smart contracts, wallet hacking. Criminal groups also use crypto assets to ask for payment of ransoms, so ransomware payments. And we saw examples last year where the ransoms were paid in crypto assets. Terrorism is also funded by crypto assets, perhaps not in the same order of magnitude, but we've heard examples of that today. And crypto assets are also, of course, used in the dark web. Crypto assets can also be used to recycle the proceeds of crime and hide those proceeds. So if we want to seize the proceeds of crime, we have to consider this aspect as well. Very often a criminal's money now will not be invested in a car or a building, a watch or a bank account, but rather on a USB key which has a wallet, and that wallet will contain very high value NFTs. A criminal group can buy NFTs, resell them to individuals. How do we trace those? How do we combat that? That is one of the big problems for the law enforcement bodies in the future. Well, let's make sure that we've got a view of the whole landscape for this panel, which is new threats, so that we get the fullest picture possible. Perhaps I could ask each of you what you see as the threats. We've talked about the uses of crypto assets. Some of them are perfectly legal. Others so I wonder what other threats come out of this particular financial tool. I'm thinking, for example, in terms of financial governance. Mr. Weiglein, you have been involved in regulating financial practices. So what threats do you see through this means of exchange?
Well, one is, I think, fairly obvious. That's the threat of misguiding people into investments they don't understand and defraud them of their possessions. I think we can see in all our countries that there is strong advertising for investments in virtual assets, and especially younger people who maybe otherwise had never even participated in capital markets before, are participating in investments in crypto assets because it's like an in thing to do. And whenever you have investment frenzies like that, there's obviously the threat of a bubble that's bursting and of people losing a lot of money. But there's also a stability issue, because we see now on a larger scale that also large international investment funds start investing in digital assets and virtual assets. That may not be an entirely bad thing, because if you have a well-balanced portfolio where the individual assets in the portfolio do not correlate with each other, and virtual assets have little correlation with other securities, then this actually increases stability. But if you overdo it, if the portfolio is not well balanced, or if there is a crash, or I don't know, you lose the key to a digital wallet, all these things have happened, there may also be a stability issue involved.
Monsieur le procureur, vous avez...
Attorney General, you talked about crime linked to crypto assets. I wonder if you could tell us what you see as the threats, those that already exist and those that you anticipate in the future, linked to these crypto assets.
Certainly, I would say at the outset, virtual assets are often used to layer transactions to hide the origin of money derived from illicit activity. In addition to the harms caused to victims and society as a whole because of those crimes, those efforts to disguise ill-gotten gains can hurt law enforcement's efforts to follow the money, which is our fundamental investigative tool in these types of cases and prosecutions. Let me be clear, ransomware, in my view, is one of the most serious threats that we have to our public safety and our national and global economic security. It is now being used, ransomware is now being used to attack municipal governments, police departments, critical infrastructure, And the business of ransomware continues to evolve. Many actors are now, what we're seeing is that actors are now researching their potential victims to extort as much money as possible from them. To avoid detection from law enforcement, actors are now migrating to the dark web, which we've already heard references to, using the Tor network, for example, to host sites that they use to anonymously communicate with victims or to even publish stolen victim data. We're even seeing some actors who are demanding that ransoms be paid in anonymity-enhanced currencies or AECs. Even worse, we're seeing ransomware developers using and offering ransomware as a service, an arrangement in which the developers license their ransomware itself to affiliates for a fee. The practical effect of that is that ransomware as a service lowers the bar to entry to cybercrime because essentially criminals don't even have to invest in owning the ransomware itself. An additional threat, the significant differences in regulatory approaches to cryptocurrency across governments worldwide means that as a global economy, we will continue to grapple with the fast-paced development of cryptocurrencies. That unevenness leads to some true inconsistencies, some real gaps in regulation and supervision in some regions of the world. And those gaps create the opportunity, in my view, for regulatory arbitrage. Those gaps threaten our collective ability to enforce the law, given the global and frankly cross-border nature of the transactions that we're dealing with.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Utterson, can regulation anticipate the new threats? Are you anticipating them? Or are you dealing with existing threats that are undermining the existing crypto asset market?
I think that we need to be aware that this is an extremely fast evolving market. But I think that some of the things we need to do at the European level from a legislative point of view, we know. So when it comes to the threats that have been mentioned, there is a posing threat on consumer protection. There are some member states now regulating publicity around cryptocurrencies and the selling of those kind of products, which I think is extremely important because for the moment was completely not regulated. And another thing which is very important in order to prevent fraudulent schemes and products to be sold is that there is an authority that supervises and authorizes those activities. And this is what we are going to establish with the MiCA regulation when it is in place. We hope that we can have a single European supervisor, ESMA in that case, who will need to authorize the activities before those products are sold. So this is one part which is essential when it comes to consumer protection and avoiding fraudulent schemes and cryptocurrencies to run in our market. And secondly, and I link to what has been mentioned now, I think what is most important is that we manage to track all the operations when it comes to anti-money laundering. We are not being able to track the operations at the moment, and this is why cryptocurrencies are so easily used by fraudulent activities and have an illicit origin. And for that, the recast of the transfer of funds regulation is going to be very important. Well, the Council, the European Council, has already a position on that. Every transaction in cryptocurrencies that will happen between a service provider and another service provider of cryptocurrencies will have to apply the travel rule and verify it, which means that we will know the data and the know your customer due diligence will be applied. Something which is also new and what the Council has adopted is that transactions between those CASPs and the unhosted wallets will also be covered by that travel rule. So we will also be able to track the origin of that money. Now, on the side of the Parliament, we are still discussing those issues, but in my view, when MiCA enters into force with giving powers to the supervision and authorization of their activities and the travel rule will be in place, we will be closing major loopholes that we have at the moment in our legislation. Now, we know for sure that this is an evolving market. New threats will come. And of course, we will have to be the legislators. We have to adapt very fast to that as you are doing now at the national level.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Nicolas Louvet, congratulations, first of all. You raised 15 million in funds recently, so the market sees this as potential. And the threat is not something that is undermining the activity per se. How do you see those threats panning out that market authorities and legislators are describing?
Alors forcément, normalement ça devrait marcher.
Of course, it's rather difficult for me to take the floor given what we've already heard this afternoon. I could answer in hours and hours, but I'll try to be brief. There are some things that I fundamentally agree with you on. New technologies and crypto assets are involved in fraud and terrorism activity, embezzlement, which can impact savers, for example, and it can be used to process illegal funds. But crypto assets didn't invent these activities. If you look at ransomware, crypto assets didn't invent ransomware. It's a question of cybersecurity and protecting IT systems. The main threat, therefore, is that we live in a digitized world where a lot of information runs through many different types of device. And these devices are to be found everywhere in countries, businesses, and what have you. And there are entry points all over the place. We are humans, we're fallible, and one is always cleverer than someone else. And they find that gap in the system, and criminal organizations exploit those gaps. And that can lead to huge problems. Crypto assets, yes, can be used as a way of paying a ransom. There is also embezzlement, fake platforms pretending to be investments that they're not. Indeed, my own company has been, the name of my own company has been used in a similar scheme. But that sort of thing exists everywhere. You've got crime relating to diamonds. Crime wasn't invented in 2009 with the Bitcoin or when blockchain was first invented. We have these crypto assets and they represent only 1% of those are reported as being related to criminal activities. I think we have to look at the advantages that it offers. I mean, I don't have a banknote with me because we use them less and less. But if you look at a banknote in your wallet, you don't know who owned it previously. Perhaps it passed through the hands of somebody who earned it in an illegal way. Blockchains and the assets that use blockchains are only pseudo-anonymous. They allow you to trace the asset. You've got chain analysis by an American company, are very much used by police forces around the world in order to understand transactions and trace criminals. So let's not see only the bad. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. These transactions are not the source of our problems. We had the problems beforehand, and the source of the problems are criminal organizations, individuals who have always looked to use technologies, whether it be crypto assets or others, to serve their goals. So we have to look at what these technologies can offer our ecosystem. I think that Mr. Polite from the US began by talking about the advantages of what we have, we can offer here, and the reduction in costs in the financial system that these assets might offer. So let's look at the whole picture, look at the benefits as well as the problems. When it comes to crime, yes, we have to use the tools available to us, and there are chain analysis tools that can be used. There are great engineers around the world that help us understand the data. We have IT systems that make it possible to analyze blockchains. Now, I heard about fake platforms earlier and contracts, embezzlement. But look, you can't fight against stupidity. If somebody doesn't understand, you have to educate them, give them information, but they have to have the freedom to act. We live in most of our countries in a democracy, certainly every country represented here. So I'm sorry, but we have to allow people to do whatever they want, or be free to do whatever they want. If somebody wants to choose between 100,000, 10,000 and zero, that's their choice. If the purchase is legal, and if the platform they buy the asset on is legal, then let's stop. Because there's not much difference between that and buying a share or buying a piece of land in provincial France. There are benefits, there are risks, but I think we have to also look at the regulation of the platforms. There are solutions out there. French legislation, the PACT legislation, has brought in certain rules. If you assume that an asset, crypto or otherwise, is something that we can't ignore. Otherwise, we just go back to dollars and yen and normal money. And you have a platform that acts as an intermediary between crypto assets and old-fashioned money. It might be in Austria, it might be in the US, it might be in Finland, it might be anywhere. These platforms have to be regulated. The platforms have to be regulated in a standardized way, or as standardized as can be across the world, so that whether you buy a crypto asset in Kazakhstan illegally or in a legal operation elsewhere, when you come to change it into conventional money, you have to justify the origin of the money, and the platform can say you can't justify it, you can't show where the money has come from. Therefore, there'll be a report to TrackFin or FUIUs or whatever, and the platform blocks their, freezes their funds or refuses the transaction, and then that person's transactions will go no further. So we can already map criminality across the globe, and I think that's a useful avenue to look at. Let's look at those avenues. I mean, we can come back to this travel rule as well later. I'm taking up a lot of time now, I know, but I would like to hear from the MEP present about that and the GDPR. Who is going to own this data? Who's the data going to be transferred to when it comes to information between our client and a CASP or an unhosted wallet? This is very complex. It throws up security issues, and if the data is hacked, we don't know what we do.
Okay, let's get into that. Let's explore that a bit more. That was part of the idea to not to have any upfront judgments. We wanted a full snapshot of the context, what we're talking about. Hear from everybody, from the judiciary, from the police, from a financial authority, but also from people on the ground, and understand what the trade-offs are between practice and the rules. So before we get into some of the concrete detail of what regulation could look like, of the environment you describe, maybe we can talk to you, Harold Weiglein, about what you see as being the really issues. You talked about financial vehicles. Now, what is an additional difficulty? What additional issues need to be regulated, which related specifically to technology? Are there additional points that we need to look at in addition to or the existing financial regulation?
Well, let me start from the point mentioned before. It's true that, I mean, crime has existed a long time before crypto assets were invented. Same with investment fraud. But that's exactly the reason why in the area of finance we have very tight regulation that covers everything from traceability of transactions. There are no anonymous deposits allowed anywhere in the world. When you buy or sell securities, there's a tight regulation to make sure that clients understand the risk. And this is on both sides of the Atlantic, by the way. The US regulations are just as strict, sometimes even stricter than rules in Europe. And that's a problem we know. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is more that where we have a technology that mimics the qualities of securities or money, but offers loopholes to evade the existing regulation, that's where we start running into problems. And that's where, for instance, in the area of illicit finance, wherever you can separate control of an asset or a stream of money from the actual stream of money, then that's actually a carte blanche for illegal activity, because you have no way of linking proceeds from a crime to the crime. That's why we have strict regulations in the real world. And as I said, if we want to be technology neutral, treat like as like, then these same rules, we have to make sure that these rules apply in the virtual world as well. And this is what we're after, not more than and not less.
Thank you. Assistant Attorney General, in your experience, have you identified any additional challenges presented by crypto assets in trying to combat money laundering in the United States?
My colleagues my colleague that just spoke is absolutely accurate. It is this crypto framework did not create fraud, abuse, money laundering, ransomware, but it has led to its rapid evolution, certainly. And the real concern that we have is, again, that pseudo-anonymity aspect of virtual assets that creates gaps for regulators and law enforcement that can then be exploited by criminal actors to commit those types of criminal activities like money laundering and terrorist financing. What we are able to do, while we may be able to at different times, we were able to trace the illicit transactions, we're not able to necessarily identify some or all of the parties to those transactions. And so what the result is that they are avoiding and evading detection from law enforcement for their criminal activity. This is particularly the case when we see criminals using techniques to maintain that anonymity and to obscure the source of their illicit funds when they're conducting these types of transactions. I'm talking about the use of things like mixers or tumblers or chain hopping, or again, anonymity enhanced currencies. What I do want to underscore here is that in the United States, websites or companies that are offering those types of services, I'm talking about mixing and tumbling services that are engaging in money transmission, in my view, they would therefore be considered MSVs subject to our Bank Secrecy Act and other laws, as well as other countries' AML and CFT frameworks. And as a result, they can be charged and they can face criminal and civil liability under our statutes, 1960, for failing to register, or even under our BSA for failing to have adequate AML procedures to collect customer identification. They can also be criminally liable for money laundering, in my view, because again, the service is designed, those types of services are designed specifically to conceal or disguise the nature, the location, the source, the ownership, and the control of a financial transaction.
Merci.
Thank you. Turning back to you, Thomas de Ricolfi. Obviously, the role of regulation, having identified the difficulties, the shortfalls, or the additional difficulties which are enablers of illicit activity. The goal of regulation, of course, is to try and resolve those in some ways. Now, what for you would be the additional features of crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, which present you with additional difficulties on top of more traditional currencies? Just coming back to what was said before, obviously crypto currencies do not create crime. Rather, crime has adapted to the latest technology. And before, we had fixed landline telephones. Now we have mobiles. Everyone's gone mobile for quite for obvious reasons. it was a bit of now we've gone on to encrypted telephone calls, and so every time technology evolves, then criminals are not far behind. That's entirely normal, if you like. It's entirely usual behavior. And so cryptocurrency, the issue is anonymity. And it creates a kind or source of anonymity, and it's more difficult to track and trace for investigators because of mixers, which will mix different investment portfolios and then reshuffle the deck, as it were, and then redeal the cards, making it more difficult to get back to the start of the chain. Now, there are systems we have which allow us to get back up the chain, but this is one of the advantages, but also one of the disadvantages of crypto is that there are traces left everywhere. Now, if you use cash, you can cover your tracks, whereas if you're using video conferencing, using telephones, using any digital technology, that you always leave a trace. There's always a trail. And so now obviously there are tools to muddy the waters and to try and cover one's tracks. The issue is always to try and get hold of the private key, which allows you to access the wallet. Now, sometimes that's on a ledger, could be on a USB stick traditionally, but now it's stored on the cloud. And so, as I said, it comes back to what I was saying before, creating distance between the culprits and the authorities. That makes it more difficult. And so to combat this more effectively, we need better regulation and closer supervision of crypto assets. Not cryptocurrencies. It's not the currencies that are the problem. It's the assets, which are the difficulty for us. And then we need to distinguish between fungible and non-fungible cryptocurrencies. Because for criminal groups, it's the NFTs which are of great interest. It was mentioned this morning, which can be used in the gambling industry, where digital currency is used to buy property, for example. Essentially, we're moving into the metaverse. So sort of that's going to be the future playground, as it were, of major criminal networks. Turning to you, Namita Utasun. Criminals have adapted to the new economic and technological environment. How do you understand these additional features, these specifics of crypto assets, in particular with a view to regulating them and supervising them in future?
Yes, well, I think what it is very, very important is that there is a level playing field with the rest of the financial activities. And here I would like to go back to some of the things that have been said. Well, firstly, when you say, when somebody said, well, we have to let anybody invest their money wherever they want, it's their own responsibility. Well, sorry, but this is not how financial regulation works. It is the responsibility of regulators and of legislators to be sure that the people who buy certain instruments know exactly where they're investing their money. I mean, in financial activities, any instrument issued needs to issue a prospectus. There's all kinds of subordinated debt that are forbidden to be sold in the retail. This is how financial regulation works, and this is why we believe that crypto activity should work also like that. Also, when you compare cryptocurrencies with cash, well, I have to say that, well, of course, virtual currencies are more traceable than cash for sure. But they do not have the same transaction costs, and they do not have the physical limitation as cash. So that's why I believe that anonymous transactions, as we do have in cash, should not happen because they are much more riskier. Then there was a question to me also related to whom the information of the travel rule will be sent. Well, when it comes to the recast we are doing of the TFR. The proposal will apply to the travel rule that will be registered in the EU, because we will have a register at EU level, which is going to be extremely important. And here I want to go also to another point which is important, is that we need to know also what kind of CASPs pose high risks. And that's why one of the proposals in MiCA from my group is that we have a list of CASPs that do not fulfill a European Union criteria. And the final point on the protection of personal data. Well, GDPR, of course, will apply to all these activities. And when it comes to cybersecurity, we're also negotiating another piece of legislation, which is DORA on operational resilience, which will also apply to crypto assets. So I think that also, to react to the question that was posed to me by the moderator, I think what we are basically doing with crypto assets, we're not killing the industry, not at all. We are putting rules which actually will create a level playing field with other kind of financial activities.
Well, quite. That's precisely the point. Now, we are in the EU. We have one set of rules here, but if you look across the Atlantic to the United States, they might consider their Assistant Attorney General, you might consider there to be too many rules, which would hinder the emergence of new lines of business. Now, how can we reconcile any potential tension arising there? Now, have there been any approaches made to our American partners, for example, such as to avoid an excess of rules hindering the emergence of new business? Is that something you're envisaging doing?
I certainly do, and frankly, we view both outreach to the private sector, and I feel a little bit. I want to just make sure our colleague with Coinbase appreciates the fact that as regulators, we are not enemies of this new technology, and frankly, when I speak to similarly situated colleagues like himself that are working in this space on a day-to-day basis, they are just as concerned about rooting out those bad actors who are ultimately undermining the public confidence in this technology going forward. And so I certainly look forward to our continued dialogue after this and going forward with his assistance to make sure that we're able to continue to root out those individuals. Separately, putting aside the private sector, I think it's important to really highlight the need for international cooperation here. It's frankly a key component of any comprehensive approach that we deal with when we're talking about the global economy, but particularly here when we're talking about crypto assets and the type of criminality that we're seeing engaged in over and over, for example, ransomware, where it's difficult to identify the actors themselves. Oftentimes, the actors, the underlying data are all across borders. And so we've had to rely on that type of interaction and cooperation across borders to actually investigate and prosecute those types of cases. And we've seen that type of cooperation, that type of assistance from our international partners over and over again, whether we're talking about the recent Sononokibi, our evil ransomware prosecution here, or even going back to last year when we prosecuted in January individuals that were involved in the NetWalker ransomware.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Weiglein, a question for a financial conduct authority. Is there also this concern that you're over-regulating, over-structuring things, and that would hinder the emergence of future lines of business which could be a source of prosperity? As we know, security departments are worried about security issues. You're in charge of financial and economic matters. Do you worry perhaps that you could be acting as a hindrance as well as a good regulator?
Maybe in the same way as we are sometimes worried about over-regulating the financial sector in general, which is a charge that is sometimes raised against us. But actually in the public debate over recent years, it's been the other way around. We haven't really done anything on crypto assets in Europe for a long time because we thought, you know, it's a small industry, it's not relevant to financial stability. And actually what kick-started regulation in Europe was the attempt by Facebook to create its own currency, because that would have been on a scale involving potentially billions of people using something as a means of payment, and that's a stability concern. It was only that triggered MiCA in particular in Europe. And here I also have to say, and this highlights our concerns, we looked into the specifications of what Libra, as it was called at the time, was going to be like. And what we saw was carefully crafted to avoid falling under securities regulation and financial regulation. So precisely what I mentioned before, some people use new technologies to evade existing regulation and regulation that's there for a good purpose, because we've learned from the mistakes in the past. And it's absolutely true that this regulation ultimately also protects the crypto sector, because there was a time in the past when capital markets were more lightly regulated. And of course, for a while, you can have more investments, more retail investors piling into those markets. But then there's the big crash, lots of people lose their money, and then confidence will be gone for decades. And it will be very hard to recreate. And in the end, you damage a sector of the market by not having the appropriate regulation.
Monsieur le député,
Member of Parliament, we mentioned the European reaction after the Facebook announcements or the Meta announcements about setting up a currency. If you want to keep a balance between a possibility to develop and create something new and innovation within Europe, you want to have that field for innovation, but at the same time you need to regulate something which is potentially difficult. How do you square that circle?
Well, I think that MiCA regulation will cover different kind of crypto assets. It will cover cryptocurrencies, of course. It will cover stable coins, and it will cover also asset-backed crypto elements. And that, I think that we will have a regulation. We will cover a whole range of different elements, because those different elements pose different activities. Cryptocurrencies pose one kind of threat. I think when we talk about stable coins, it's more something. I think those can, in the long term, pose more significant systemic financial risks, and that is why in the MiCA regulation that will be regulated tighter. Including Libra and others alike. But also I want to bounce back to what has been just said by our Austrian colleague. I think that indeed, I think MiCA will provide a stable legal framework at EU level, which at the end of the day will protect the activities of the issuers of crypto assets that can have a positive impact in our economy. And again, I think that once this regulation will be in place, the confidence of consumers will significantly increase, and it will be an opportunity. That's why I want to mention that all the elements that have been mentioned this morning, I want to repeat, are not again entitled to crack down the industry. On the contrary, to give a stable regulatory framework as we have for all the financial activities.
Est-ce qu'il y a justement...
Is there a consensus amongst the police services in this area, Thomas de Rigolfi? What points do you think would actually block things, stop us from being able to set up this framework or supervision of cryptocurrencies?
Sur la supervision, je crois que...
On supervision, I think that from the police side, we are in favor of supervision and strong regulation. France already has got strong regulation in this area with TRACFIN, and we've got the FIUs. The more regulation we have, the further these bodies go from there. These go from our territory. So we're in favor of strong regulation, and we would like to see this homogeneously across the European Union, because criminal groups do actually play on the differences in regulations. They know how to play that game. Criminal groups, the most vicious ones, have specialists who will actually look and see where there are gaps in the regulation. They will look at the texts that come out, and they adapt their policies and consequences. They will actually benefit or use these holes in legislation. So we're in favor of strict, strong regulation to make sure that we can trace movement. That's also a guarantee for the consumer, for the user. It's also, I believe, a way of deterrent, as a deterrent for those who are having to trace these criminals. It's also important that we don't have these differences in legislation, because the criminal groups benefit. Mr. Veglan, there seems to be a consensus and harmonization that's happening, but what could actually be the stumbling block? What could prevent us from actually having this harmonization so that the players cannot actually partake in criminal activities? And then we've got the police as well, who want to have the right tools. They need to have the right tools that will stop, which will not block them from taking action.
Well, at the moment, I don't really see many obstacles. I used to see obstacles before we engaged in the work on MiCA, because it wasn't actually the case that there was no regulation of crypto assets in Europe before. It just depended on national legislation. Because the issue in Europe is we have a large amount of financial sector regulation, but maybe this will surprise some people. There is, as of yet, no European definition of what a security is. We rely on the definitions in the national legal frameworks, and that's where the connection to the European framework is. But that means in some countries, the national definition of securities covers crypto assets, whereas in other countries it doesn't. And that led to a very uneven playing field in Europe. That was the obstacle in regulation, because in some countries you had fairly good rules in place, but since we have a single market in financial service in Europe, you had other countries where this was not the case. And just to mention one thing that I remember from that time, we found out in Austria that many people were buying life insurance from a provider in a small European country, life insurance policies that were entirely based on crypto assets, which is not the type of product that we would specifically recommend to retail investors.
Monsieur le député, dans le cadre...
To our Member of Parliament, in European debates, do you feel that there are some sticking points or some blockages on the framework and supervision of these activities?
Well, yes, well, indeed, there are fundamental discussions on many issues that are difficult to address, I would say. And maybe here I would go back to the discussions on the environmental impact of the mining of the cryptocurrencies, which is a major issue, because as I told you before, Bitcoin uses as much energy as a whole economy in the Netherlands. So how to do that? This is, for instance, for legislatures, something that is it's extremely difficult. Some are advocating for banning the proof of work consensus mechanism, which is the mechanism that Bitcoin uses. Actually, there was an official from ESMA this week quoted in the Financial Times advocating for that, and we have amendments in the European Parliament who would go that way. But of course, that would mean that we would be banning in Europe the whole mechanism of functioning of the Bitcoin, which of course is extremely challenging. Another possibility, indeed, would be to establish certain criteria under which the crypto assets need to operate in order to have a sustainable way of functioning, and the Commission could propose some benchmarks. So, for instance, that particular point is of extremely difficult discussion for regulators and legislators, I would say. And then we have also problems in finding solutions for very difficult transactions. It has been mentioned here. What happens to peer-to-peer transactions? We are going to avoid anonymization of crypto transactions when a service provider is involved, but peer-to-peer transactions will completely continue to be completely anonymized, which poses a major role. So how to apply customer due diligence in those kinds of transactions? It's something extremely difficult, and we are having also a lot of discussions around that. And as it has been mentioned as well, the issue of data protection. And once we are going to oblige CASPs to provide custody due diligence rules, how this information is protected. I mentioned it before, GDPR will apply, but then of course there is challenges when it comes to the enforcement of that legislation. So yes, indeed, I think that discussions in several areas of the regulation of the cryptocurrencies are still difficult, and we are still trying to look at the nitty-gritty details of the different solutions.
Monsieur le procureur, qu'est-ce que
to the Attorney General, what in the discussions that you have in your files, what are you expecting to get from this private sector? What expectations do you have from your counterparts in the private sector or private bodies that you're dealing with?
Thank you very much related to the question related to the private sector, and I'll get to that point, but I did want to raise just a few points related to some of the stumbling blocks. There are some of the data privacy requirements that various jurisdictions have do hamper our ability to obtain records. Records preservation and production becomes a challenge for us to continue to investigate these areas. Another stumbling block that we see over and over again in our investigations, particularly even in the area of being able to serve and seek documents and additional data as part of our investigations, is that cryptocurrency and hosting companies, sometimes they claim to be located everywhere, but nowhere. They have personnel in one place, but they're registered in another place, and their records are in another place. And so that becomes a very difficult process for us to navigate, even as all of our countries that are represented here and many others, we all have mutual legal assistance treaty agreements in place, but those requests oftentimes become hampered and delayed, resulting again in our inability ultimately to investigate here. As to the private sector, again, my hope, and again, I go back to my colleague Nicholas here, who's represented well, my view here is that I hear over and over again from CEOs and leaders in this space that they are just as interested in rooting out wrongdoers here. One of the requirements that we ask for over and over again, and we're hoping that other jurisdictions lead and follow along with us in terms of incorporating the need for mandatory reporting for cyber breaches. But it goes beyond just those types of requirements. They have to be key partners in the fight against illicit financing. As with any specialized technology-driven industry, effective regulation and policy in this area also require close cooperation. It requires close cooperation between the public and the private sector whenever possible. That includes direct engagement with companies that operate in this virtual asset space, with the banks and other financial institutions that may be affected by virtual asset regulation, and most importantly, with the actual community of users themselves.
Merci. Alors...
Thank you. Well, yes, as concerns the role of the private sector, can I ask how you think that they can contribute in this debate? What type of contribution can the private sector have?
Je m'inscris exactement dans ce qui...
Well, I must say I do fully agree with what's just been said. How can we contribute? Well, we've got to be regulated, first of all. I've always been in favor of regulated activities, especially for the platforms. MiCA, I think, is a very good thing. In France, we're already ahead of the game because we have something which is very, very solid, very robust, with a definition of activities and rules which are very clear as to what should be done. And there are obligations for declarations. There are obligations also on people who actually run the platforms, who are responsible for the activities on the platforms. There's also a certification which goes very far, and there's protection for savers, and there's information for savers, etc. We've already integrated all of that into the process here in France, but we should go even further. We've got to make sure this is valid at European level as well, and we've got to make sure that there are equivalences at global level, because with internet, there's no border. There is no limit. I just wanted to add another point before I actually respond fully to your question, because it's something that was raised about the level playing field. We have to ensure that there are sanctions, that there are penalties, that there has to be sanctions for these platforms that don't respect the rules, and for all of those who aren't actually in conformity with the rules or who are doing a bad job. If I look at if we don't work right, if we make a mistake, then we have to shoulder our responsibility and do everything we can to do things the right way. It's important that we have that, so that we don't have platforms which actually are in the European, who actually have activity here in the European Union, but they can be very decentralized, or some of them might well be in other countries, first-level countries who address the European clientele without actually being present here, and they might actually have activities here, but they should be responsible, and they should actually have to cover our meet our legislation. Yes to MiCA, yes to sanctions. That's important. As far as the platforms are concerned, that is important. But then, as far as the stable coins, the NFTs, and the cryptocurrencies are concerned, MiCA's got a lot of work to do on that. I believe there must be regulation there to make sure that the text in that regard can be perhaps reworked. They're a bit tough as far as innovation is concerned. These are very, very young mechanisms. And I think we're going to perhaps hamper innovation and new technology if we're too strict on matters that we're not really familiar with yet. We should be vigilant. Yes, indeed, NFTs are being used very broadly, but I think we shouldn't. Should we go as far as restricting them or integrating the peer-to-peer within the MiCA regulation? I think that's much too complicated. I think we've got to really work on what the platforms are doing, because they are gateways within the system where there's an exchange of proper currencies and cryptocurrencies. So what we should be doing is helping you. We've got to help the states, help the regulators. We've got to help you to understand all this, work alongside us. We do work because of our obligations that we have with TRACFIN and Europol and other bodies. We're also regulated, or sorry, we're also registered. There's an important difference there. We're also within the CSSF in Luxembourg, so we also intervene there in Luxembourg, and we're very open to have any discussion with ESMA and the European Central Bank and the European Parliament. We really, really want to work hand in glove with you. As far as the travel rules concerned, these are questions which require an interaction with our information systems. And I don't have an address for Kraken, Binance, EUB, or other platforms, or Panda, which is in Austria. I haven't got any possibility of exchanging data with them. When one of my clients sends me crypto, or if they want to leave our information system, our computer system, and send cryptocurrencies to another address, well, I have no way to exchange that information. So I want to be vigilant. I want to respect the rules to make sure that we also respect our data privacy rules, because our clients, of course, do merit that. So, yes, we're here. We really want to participate in developing this industry, but we've got to make sure that there's a level playing field for the platforms. Thomas Rigolfi, what are you expecting from the platform, from the private sector? Well, I think that we've got to work in the preventive and the prosecution area. I think we do have parallelisms already in the system that we have. The FIU is working with the banks and other bodies. We've got to make sure that we have a proper relationship between the public and private, and working with the banking sector. We've got to have these links with the private sector, because the private sector has information. They have things that they can actually provide us with. We've got to be able to show them what the new tendencies are, what the new trends are, and try and help them to providing something which is robust. Europol has a department that works on the private-public connection in this area, and I think it's important that in the future the criminal services in France and across the European Union have this connection with the private sector.
De votre point de vue,
Mr. Weiglein, what are your expectations for the private sector?
I think just like in the financial sector, of course, there needs to be a strong cooperation between the regulators and the sectors. After all, to be able to make useful regulation in an area, you need to understand how the business works, and the people doing the business are the people who understand it best. So we need that input, and we also value it. I mean, Austria is one of the countries where we have a sandbox model that's specifically there with our financial regulator to assist new companies come in with new ideas, to test those in a safe space, as it were, and to help them develop those technologies to market maturity. I know that many other European member states are doing the same, And this is one example of cooperation. And of course, before the Commission put MiCA forward, I remember many instances where we had roundtables with industry representatives in Brussels to discuss precisely all the issues that we're discussing here. Let me just say one thing on the peer-to-peer transactions as a loophole. I am convinced that after we finish with MiCA 1, it will not be the perfect system, because it will never be the perfect system. We have loopholes in AML and terrorist finance, not just where crypto assets are concerned. Let me be clear on that. There are also many loopholes when it comes to the corporate sector and corporate registration, shell companies and all that. It's always an issue of conflicts of laws and various jurisdictions and differences in information exchange and data registration that we're faced with. And it extends into the real world, and people always spot the issues and try to exploit them for criminal purposes. So I'm absolutely certain after we're done with MiCA 1, after a couple of years, we'll have MiCA 2, because we'll keep learning from our mistakes and try to come up with a better system, but we'll never have a perfect system.
Nous avons une question qui nous...
We have a question now from our audience. We've got Peter Todorov from the financial unit in Bulgaria, and he asks about anonymity and the anonymity linked to crypto assets. You wouldn't let somebody cross a border anonymously. Should we be allowing anonymous transactions then? Or shouldn't we go to a declarative system where people are obliged to state their identity? Would anyone like to answer that question from our Bulgarian colleague?
Well, the question is whether anonymity cannot be mitigated. I think it can be. I mean, we've heard some examples for technical solutions. And where it can't, it should at least be contained. As I said, anonymous transactions are harmful, but they don't only exist in the crypto area at the moment.
Oui, mais elles existent aussi dans les cryptos.
They exist there too, and we have to try to contain them. I mean, one attempt that we've been doing is that even if you have a technical problem with tackling anonymity in the virtual sector, you can tackle it where these funds try to re-enter the real world, because that's usually where financial institutions come into play, and they need to know where the funds are coming from, or they shouldn't touch them. And you know, if you have anonymous funds in the virtual space that you can't use, then they're also not very useful to criminals.
Si je puis me permettre,
Bien sûr.
If I may, I would just remind you that within the exception of the AES like Monero, the blockchains are pseudo-anonymous, not entirely anonymous. We have a ledger, we have all the addresses and information for all of the customers. So if you've been through my company, I will have an awful lot of information about you, including your addresses. And I'll be able to look at the addresses that you received crypto assets from and where you sent them. So that's transparency, but not necessarily identity. No, but you can cross-reference information, and it gives you a very good mapping of the transactions. And of course, we're not following every transaction just to follow everyone's movements. It's only the suspect transactions. So we have the information to use already. For the purely anonymous crypto assets, well, we don't support those. If somebody wants to buy that, then we will make a report as a result. We have analysis systems that show whether mixers or the dark web has been used, because we can detect that and we can see whether there are suspicious transactions involved, and we make reports on the basis of that. So we can give information to the authorities that will be useful to them in their investigations. So there are ways of regulating here. Now we have to be vigilant with technology, and we have to invest. The crypto assets require investment in research, for example, so that we can continue working on data and on the system. We didn't say much about the energy side of things that was mentioned earlier. Mr. Attorney General, what about anonymity? What is your view of the question of anonymity?
Attendez. La liaison, oui. Alors attendez, je vais basculer sur monsieur, pardon.
My apologies. Let me move to Mr. Urtasun while we sort that technical problem out. Our Bulgarian colleague has asked a question about identifying those carrying out transactions. What's your view of that?
Well, I think it's very important that we apply customer due diligence to the transactions, and this is what we are going to do with the travel rule when it will enter into force. So any transaction between CASPs or between CASPs and peer-to-peer transactions, as agreed in the Council, because the Parliament still has to fix its position, will need to verify the identity of the person doing the transaction. Now, to explain, to give you the complete picture, there is a discussion going on whether we should be applying a threshold under which we should respect a certain degree of unanimity. This is in the Commission proposal. Everything under 1,000 threshold would still keep a certain degree of unanimity. Everything above 1,000 euros will have to provide that kind of information. Now, we're still discussing about that. The Commission has kept the threshold. The Council has eliminated that threshold. If you ask my opinion, I think that the threshold it's going to be very difficult to enforce, because according to some FIUs, if you have a threshold, it's going to be very easy to circumvent. And also according to the industry, and this is something I have learned from some CASPs, the threshold would be their life and the application of the travel rule even more difficult. So I'm tempted to say that there shouldn't be that threshold below which anonymity remains. But yes, indeed, when the recast will enter into force, this transaction will not be anonymous anymore.
Merci, merci.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to hear that this is something that's going to be discussed in businesses from an operational point of view and legal compliance, and then this comparison that will be made between regulation inside and outside of Europe. It's been a very broad field that we've discussed today. I do thank you all for taking part. Thank you, Attorney General. Thank you, Mr. Urtasun, Member of the European Parliament. Thank you for joining this transatlantic round table. Thank you for your contributions. We will now continue this afternoon with our next round table. Thank you, gentlemen.
Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.
Un grand merci à tous et donc on va.
Thank you, everybody. Well, we'll break for a couple of minutes just to give the panelists time to come up onto the stage.
Merci beaucoup.
Non, c'est mauvais programme, ça. En fait, tout le monde...
Ah d'accord, il y a une pause café.
Il y a une pause café de 15
bah, je vais le dire.
Voilà.
Pardon, je vais le dire. Là. Alors juste pour... oui, Vous souhaitez aller faire une courte pause café. Le prochain panel reprendra.
Just a quick logistical point, ladies and gentlemen. We have a 15-minute coffee break now, and the next panel will begin in 15 minutes' time.
Très bien.
C'est assez doux.
Delphine Schantz. The floor is yours, Delphine. Thank you very much. It's always a bit difficult to kick off the final panel of the day after such a busy, packed day. It's a very broad subject, and the transparency of financial transactions is a broad area. And a lot of it has already been said in earlier panels. The purpose of this panel, however, is to have a more introspective look at things. Now, I'm representing the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and our panelists represent various regional or international organisations or the private sector to give us an insight into the European legislation in the works, as well as their experience in their respective fields of activity, business in Europe and elsewhere, and examine the connection between that and what is currently being done within the EU. Now, this is a subject close to the heart of the UN Secretary General. I'm representing the UN today. The UN Secretary General is just beginning his second term of office and has made financial transparency and the renewal of the social bargain a priority of his second term. And he's asked all UN bodies to draw up more effective measures to combat tax evasion, illicit financial flows, financial fraud. And of course, those measures need to be enacted through international legislative bodies of law, in particular international conventions on corruption, but also, and you've no doubt heard about this earlier today, a few months ago, the Financial Accountability, Transparency, Integrity panel produced a report containing a number of proposals on the traceability of financial transactions and on how to improve transparent procedures, because we see that the transparency standards vary widely across the world. They widely even within the EU, and so progress is needed in order to supply better information on beneficial ownership and in particular the awarding of public contracts. Minister Delegate Schiappa mentioned this morning that the Security Council has adopted an important resolution for 2062, that is, to bolster the fight against terrorism, in particular via cutting their funding to combating financing of terrorism by freezing assets and other means. There's also a preventive aspect to that, which is that states are asked to improve the traceability of financial transactions by deploying various means and to boost their efforts to identify critical information, transmit that information, and thus feed that into judicial proceedings against terrorist financing networks, which of course exist in various countries of the world, in the support for which outside the EU is often quite marginal. The EU is beginning working on the revision of the anti-money laundering framework. That's important, and it's on that matter in particular to give us insight. I have with me this very eminent panel. So we have Marcus Player, who's been the chairman of the FATF since 2021, since last year. So it's starting a 2-year mandate. Also deputy financial director at the German Finance Ministry, again leading the fight against money laundering, but also working on the digital transformation and other matters. Very pleased to have you with us. Our next guest is Michiel Van Houlton from Transparency International, Director of Transparency International in Europe, I should say, and previously was a member of the European Parliament and was part of the Budgetary Control Committee. We also have Burkhard Mühl, who is the head of the new European Financial and Economic Crime Centre at Europol. I was mentioned this morning, but who previously in his career headed up the Directorate General on Financial Crime of Europol and is one of the founding fathers of the Camden Asset Recovery Agency. And lastly, we have Paul Deleuze, who is head of Orange Money Europe, as well as chairman of the Bank Orange Africa. So again, you're in charge of regulation of all the financial products, particularly concerning or marketed by Orange in Europe, and particularly concerning mobile phone products. Now, we are going to take this subject, this area, topic by topic. So first of all, bring about transparency by better identifying beneficial owners. This is a subject mentioned at length in the FACTI report I mentioned. Now, starting with you, Marcus, a question first of all on improving information on beneficial owners and transparency. That's an important tool in combating international organised crime, financial crime in particular. And it's also on the agenda of pretty much everyone working on the matter. That is to say, combating money laundering and funding of terrorism. FATF is working on its own standards, and we'll be soon publishing some thinking about that. Recommendation 24, I believe. Now, could you perhaps tell us something about some of the implications of that for the various jurisdictions, European and beyond?
Yeah, thank you, Delphine, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And let me perhaps start by commending the French EU Council presidency with this conference sending really a strong signal of how important AML is for Europe. So indeed, you're completely right. This is, I think, very high on the agenda of jurisdictions and of the FATF, and I think the Pandora paper have again shown how difficult the problem is and that it is not solved at all. And this is, I think, not only critical for money laundering, but you also have to have in mind the predicate offenses that are involved with beneficial ownership in transparency, and that is corruption, that is tax evasion, but that is also environmental crimes, as the UK G7 presidency has outlined in the last year. So my organization has long warned about the misuse of shell companies and trusts, and for that reason has quite a long time ago developed standards, and we see that the system is still not working very well. And why is it so? The one reason is that jurisdictions do not implement the standards effectively. So the next question is the reason now only the implementation? But I must honestly say, I think it's also there is also a problem with our standard. And the problem is that in the current standard, we only set an objective that you need to have accurate beneficial ownership information, but we didn't require them for specific instruments. And this is now something that will change. My organization has looked at the standard for quite a while now, and we have worked on a revision. We have had a public consultation in October with all the stakeholders, and I think we will now adopt the new standard in the next plenary at the end of February, beginning of March. And your question, what will this mean? And I think the first and foremost element is that we will require all the 200 jurisdictions that have committed to implement our standards to set up beneficial ownership register. They can also go for an alternative system that is the same way effective, but then they have to explain why they do so. So that is, I think, at least the right direction, and this is a comply or explain approach. So I think that will push jurisdictions into setting up beneficial ownership registries. The second requirement is that they need to verify the information so that they are accurate and they are always updated in the registry. That is also important, so that you cannot just issue Mickey Mouse as the owner of a company, which is true for some countries, which we all know. that this is possible. So the third element is that we will prohibit the creation of new bearer shares. The fourth is that we strengthen the disclosure requirements for nominee arrangements. And what I think is also very interesting, we require jurisdictions to assess and mitigate the risks posed by foreign companies in their countries. And lastly, we will require tougher rules on using information to prevent corruption in public procurement, and on providing quick and effective international cooperation to support other jurisdictions' investigations. So I think all this is now the right way forward and will close loopholes, but may not be the end of the road.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Just a follow-up question, perhaps. The standards are going to be adopted, there'll be a revision. In terms of the upcoming mutual evaluations, once the standards have been modified, these mutual reviews, will there be an obligation to either to have a register in place, as I say, of beneficial owners, or demonstrate to the assessors that they have an alternative system which enables the same information to be available? So the fact that if you don't have a register of beneficial owners, will not be seen as a hindrance, or won't be judged negatively by the assessors, to the extent that, or if the country can demonstrate they have a similar system which is an alternative and which meets all the requirements of such a register.
Yeah, I think you already gave the answer. The assessors will assess this negatively if the jurisdictions just keep their system, and we see already in the fourth round that this has not worked. So they need to change something. And if they now have the crossroad ahead of them and they can choose the transparency register, which has the assumption of being an effective system, or go for another alternative system, I think they will go the first road. But they just cannot stay and remain the system as it was and get another bad remark. So there will be a lot of pressure through the mutual evaluation, which is the instrument we work with.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Turn to you now, Michiel, to continue with the question of beneficial ownership registers. Transparency International obviously is engaged against money laundering and corruption in general. And we were involved in the public consultation, as Marcus has said, on the revision of the standards, in particular recommendation 24 on transparency and beneficial owners. You're pleased to note that there was an opportunity to actually feed into and discuss the scope of that mechanism, and to identify those measures most useful to actually strengthen it. Could you tell us how Transparency International sees or why it should be mandatory to have such a register, and how that would strengthen the transparency of financial transactions?
For the question, Delphine, and my thanks also to the French Presidency for the organization of this conference, which has been extremely interesting and which will hopefully help to act as an impulse for the legislators in Brussels to act quickly on the proposals before them, and to make sure that we have proposals that will be legislation that will be effective in dealing with the problem of anti-money laundering. Transparency International indeed is an organization that fights corruption. We have over 100 chapters across the world, including in France, and I'm happy to report that in France we have an excellent cooperation with the French government on a whole host of issues, and I hope that will bear fruit during this presidency as well. Why is anti-money laundering important to an organization like Transparency International? It's because corruption and anti-money laundering are intimately linked. Trillions of euros worldwide are involved in money laundering, hundreds of billions in the EU, and one of the mechanisms that corrupt people and organizations use to hide their money is opaque and complex company structures where they can hide their funds. And that's not just actors within the EU, that's also actors from outside the European Union. We're an attractive destination for dirty money. And because of this link between corruption and anti-money laundering, corruption causes money laundering, but money laundering also couldn't exist without this corruption. There is a need to tackle these structures where people can hide their money. And that's what's happening with this legislation and with at the EU level and with the revision of the standards by FATF. And that's why these registers are important, because public registers of ownership of companies basically create a mechanism for transparency, allow the public to see, to allow journalists, civil society, NGOs, but above all the authorities to see who really owns a company, who's behind it, and who's the beneficial owner. And for this to work, obviously, you need to make sure that that the regulations are effective. And the EU has taken steps in this. In 2018, the EU adopted the fifth anti-money laundering directive, which required public registers. And you could see that this legislation, even though it's not been fully implemented everywhere, has had an immediate impact. And I'll give you a few examples. In Luxembourg last year, we had the Open Lux investigations, where there was an exposure of the wealth that had been offshored there by individuals because of the company climate that existed there. Corrupt and criminal individuals hiding their money in companies there. And the only reason we were able to find out about this was because of the public registers of ownership, which it was possible to analyze. Another example, in 2018, our Czech chapter of Transparency International discovered that the then Prime Minister Babiš was involved in a conflict of interest involving his agricultural company. And this was only possible because the Slovaks had introduced public registers of ownership that allowed civil society and others to identify this information. And as you probably know, this has led to an audit by the European Commission and a finding that there was indeed a conflict of interest. And finally, an example from Denmark, where a small bank, which I'm not going to name, not in order to protect it, but because Danish words are impossible to pronounce, was under investigation for anti-money laundering. As a result of this investigation, journalists were able to identify companies and individuals which were engaged in suspicious activity. And again, this was only thanks to these beneficial ownership registers. So they are absolutely critical for the EU, and they're critical globally. And the only question we tend to ask is, why is progress so slow? If the advantages of these registers are so great, why does it take such a long time to get more openness? Why aren't they mandatory everywhere? Why aren't they public everywhere? So we can tend to get a little bit frustrated sometimes, and I think that the general public do too whenever one of these scandals emerges. But there is indeed progress, and I'm glad you recognize the consultation document that we submitted last year to your consultation. That's a very good sign. And in fact, we've had good discussion with you on this recommendation. And yes, this is absolutely a big step in the right direction. We wouldn't be an NGO if we weren't unhappy about certain aspects as well. And we will obviously looking forward to the final version of this and hope that some of our recommendations have been taken on board. But for instance, we would have liked to see a requirement that all registers should be public and in open data format, because open data format allows you to easily analyze the data in an automated way. And a lot of, as you know, a lot of investigative journalism, for instance, these days, is based on open data analysis. We're not sure about this alternative mechanisms and whether it's necessary, the alternative mechanisms instead of registers, because we aren't convinced there's a need for that. But at least we want to make sure that if there are alternative mechanisms, then the text makes it absolutely clear that it should indeed have the same effect as a register to avoid criminals and others looking for the weakest link in the system and going to countries that have alternative mechanisms rather than a formal register. We need to have much more emphasis on verification, because there's not much point having a register if the information in it isn't verified, and we think public authorities should be responsible for doing that. We welcome the plan to ban bearer shares, but we also think that existing bearer shares should be registered in the register. We would like to see a ban on nominee shareholders and directors, and if there's no ban, then at least more transparency about who these people are and the interests that they represent, the beneficial interests that they represent. So all in all, a big step in the right direction, but also a long wish list from us as to what can be done even better.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question, because you said that the progress has been slow in coming. But what do you think are the major obstacles for various jurisdictions? We're not just talking about the European Union, but beyond Europe as well. Why are there so many difficulties? Because there are benefits in having this register to enable us to identify the beneficial owners of and having a register of beneficial owners. So because it can prevent certain financial scandals that we've seen in the past with the Pandora Papers, why is there still resistance in so many countries beyond the European Union, of course, because we know that when we go beyond the EU, there are countries where they wouldn't even dream of thinking of setting up the type of register. Where does this resistance come from? Is it public authorities? Because there is indeed pressure from some organizations for these registers to be set up. So where does the resistance come from?
Well, I think that's a difficult question. There are lots of answers to that, and I think there are lots of different reasons, and they range from technical reasons, simply, for instance, developing countries not being capable of gathering the kind of data that's necessary, setting up the required infrastructure. There are discussions about principle, about privacy and security. Of course, we have answers on those questions, but they are questions that are being raised, and they should be raised because they are important issues. There's also, of course, the question that there are governments which are corrupt and which don't want any transparency because they are corrupt, and they know that this is one of the ways to stash away their money or stash away the money of their friends, and therefore they are resistant on that basis. And then there's, for instance, the reason of inward investment. It's a tool that countries use to be competitive, to attract outside investment, to attract outside funds. And so as long as there's no global level playing field that's been agreed, it's tempting for countries, especially smaller countries, which don't have a lot of natural resources, to use this as a way to generate revenue. So there's a whole host of reasons. But none of them, in the end, are justified. It just means that we have to make sure that in any solutions that we develop, that we have an approach that takes into account all these reasons, including helping countries that are unable to do this by themselves. But I think the vast majority of countries are perfectly capable of doing this, and it's just about having the political will to do it.
Merci.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Burkout. Identifying beneficial owners is actually a challenge for any legislation or any legal activity. So what is the challenge that poses for you, and what type of measures can you adapt to overcome those difficulties?
Thank you very much for the question, Delphine. First, I also would like to thank the French Presidency for inviting me to attend this highly interesting conference. I would like to first mention that Europol has paid a lot of attention to money laundering in the past, and we have seen over the last couple of years that the member states were increasingly asking for support in financial investigations. So we decided to establish the European Economic and Financial Crime Center 1.5 years ago. And I just got the statistics recently. In the last year, we managed to support about 400 high priority cases in the center, and actually we got about 15,000 contributions to our center in financial and economic crime, which is quite a lot. And we supported investigations that led in the member states and in third countries to the seizure of approximately 900 million euros. So quite a good start. I hope we can continue at that level and even expand. And what we also see is that money laundering is increasing rapidly, and also fraud is increasing rapidly. Both are amongst the top crime areas now in the European Union. And we try to provide assistance to the member states in tackling those crime areas. We have been talking about regulation today, but I also just would like to take this opportunity to highlight that there's a lot going on in the underground banking. There's a lot going on in unregulated financial transactions. So we see regularly cash pickups that happen across the European Union. We have money brokers operating from outside the European Union, actually handling those money pickups, and they manage to transfer the money within a short period of time on a global level, completely under the radar, and that is a very worrying development. So we see that criminals avoid all the regulations we have, so also that needs to be focused in the future. As regards the beneficial ownership, of course, that is at the core of fighting money laundering. And we saw in the Pandora Papers that it is still possible to buy real estate in the European Union by presenting an offshore company and not disclosing the beneficial owner. And I believe this is a point where we should pay more attention, that the obliged entities, when entering into business with that kind of opaque business constructions, that enhanced due diligence should be exercised. And if there are any concerns about the true beneficial owner of a company, an SDR actually should be filed so that then a proper investigation can be carried out. So that would be one of the measures we could think of to have more success. And lastly, I would like to mention the registers. They are certainly very important. We currently see that the EU Recovery Fund will release about 800 billion euros to the member states. And that, of course, will trigger the attention of fraudsters as well. And we need to have a system in place where we can identify clearly the beneficial ownership of companies that are applying for those funds, so that in case when a fraud case happens, that we have the means to identify actually where the money went to. And for that purpose, it's important also that law enforcement has access to those registers, to the beneficial owner registers, but also to the centralized bank account registers, and the planned interlinking of those registers at European Union. So that will speed up the investigations quite considerably.
Oui, merci.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. We've seen that, and the resolution did actually underscore the need to actually ask member states to think about the possibility, as some member states in the European Union already are doing, to have a centralization of bank account details, so that we can actually identify different transactions or find out to which individual accounts, which accounts people have in individual financial institutions. That really does seem like it would be a useful measure if we wanted to actually fight against financial criminality. But it seems indeed to still be underdeveloped in many countries. So I think that's something that should be reinforced, and something which would help agencies like Europol to actually enforce the legislation. Now, perhaps we should be talking more about the European context, but we talked this morning about the implementation of AMLA, or the setting up of the new revision of the implementation of the AMLA, the authority. They're going to be taking a number of financial institutions under direct supervision, and there'll be some indirect supervision working with the control bodies in other countries. What do you think? What type of cooperation should there be? What would you like to see as far as cooperation with the AMLA, the agency, and Europol, so, or AMLA and the law enforcement agencies in European countries?
I would like to say that this is going towards the right direction. We welcome, of course, the proposal from the Commission. We see really the need from bringing the national system, the FIUs receiving SDRs at the national level, investigating those cases at national level, now to the European level. So this joint analysis by the FIUs in AMLA at European level is really needed. What we would like to add to the current proposal, because it's not foreseen at this stage, to have also an interaction with law enforcement and in particular also with Europol. We see that currently only about 20% of the STRs that are filed at national level for further investigation receive Europol. So come to Europol, and then we of course provide all the analytical support that we can offer. But that also means that about 80%, if not more, of the cases that are investigated at national level are never cross-checked at European level. So this is very important, and we would like to offer that possibility to the new agency when this EU FIU analysis is being undertaken in AMLA, that Europol links into that process and provides access also to the Europol data that we hold in order to enrich that analysis, to cross-match the data with our data at Europol. And that, I think, could be a significant development in investigating money laundering cases at European Union level. So this is the link we want to be built, if possible.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to you, Michiel, about how you see the legislative package which has been set up by the European Union, being presented by the Commission. Do you think that this is sufficient? Does it go far enough to enable us to detect beneficial owners and to identify them? And what about the implementation of this package of legislation? How do you see the AML legislation being effective? What do you think of the obstacles? How do you think it's going to pan out given the application of existing legislation? Do you think that the new tools can be better implemented, and will it make up for the gaps that exist in today's legislative framework? Will they enable us to better identify beneficial owners and cover the lack of registers?
And a statistic that actually just came to my mind on the beneficial ownership register question is that I think Europol once said that 80% of criminal networks use legal company structures. And when I listen to you, I'm reminded of the fact that this just indicates how much work we have to do in making sure that we make it as difficult as possible for criminals to move their money around. And obviously with developments such as crypto, like we heard in the last session, criminals always evolve with technology, and we always have to stay abreast of these technologies. We have to try and keep up with what's happening. But certainly on this question, we know exactly how it works. We have the experience of decades, if not hundreds of years of company law, and of how they can be abused. And a spate of scandals has highlighted how this works. They've already been mentioned, the Pandora Papers and lots of others, which have demonstrated how relatively easy it is to hide money, and that's also now despite the rules that we already have in place. So yes, I mean the package that was introduced in 2018 was a big improvement on the situation then, and overall I think we can be quite pleased with how Europe has been tackling this. But there are shortcomings for instance, on the definition of a beneficial owner, the question of the 25%, but how to deal with risk analysis in that context, the regulation of nominees, which I already mentioned, the lack of independent verification of BO information, and the weak sanctions, to name but a few. And then there's the inadequate implementation of the rules, because adopting the rules is one thing, but you also need to make sure that they're implemented. That's why it's good that one part of the current package is a regulation, because regulations, of course, are directly applicable in the member states. Lithuania, last time I checked, still had not implemented the directive at all. But if you look at the overview of how member states have implemented the existing legislation, then you see big differences on the kind of data that is published, on who has access to the data. Sometimes there's a paywall, the amounts of the paywall differ, sometimes registration is required. Open data, there's only Denmark and Latvia who provide that. And there's also a difference when it comes to searching, because of course a good search functionality and being able to search for both entities and names of individuals is key to being able to find the information that you need. And when you have such a wide diversity, again, people will look for the weakest link. And so we need to harmonize this better. We need to make sure that there are better minimum standards, and we need to make sure that we have adequate enforcement. And in that sense, the Commission package that's on the table now is a big step in the right direction. We think AMLA is a potential game changer. Great news, that's going to make a real difference. The real estate registries is important. Supervision for self-regulatory bodies. I mean, if you think of real estate, I mean, the UK has now left the European Union, but you know, the London real estate market has been completely destroyed by foreign oligarchs buying up real estate through shell companies. And of course, that's been happening in other parts of Europe as well. That's been a particularly attractive destination. But this goes to show that these oligarchs could not be parking their money here if we had that complete transparency everywhere. At least it would make it a lot easier for the people in their home countries to see what money was going where. And then we need better and detailed requirements for CDD and for the foreign entities, but overall we think it's a good package. There's discussion to be had on the issue of the 25% and on the risk analysis. We think the European Commission, for instance, puts too much emphasis on the figure and not enough on the risk analysis. We would like to see a much more sector-based approach, and in certain sectors, investment funds, for instance, we think there should be full transparency of beneficial owners. The problem with investment funds is that, with a few exceptions, of course, most investment funds, every beneficial owner is below 25%, so that doesn't give you any meaningful information about where money is being invested. So that's another example of where we need to improve the package that's on the table.
Merci. Marcus?
Thank you very much. Marcus, I wonder if you'd like to say something about the legislative package and perhaps the shortcomings that the European legislator needs to look at.
To be honest, I wanted to do the contrary. I wanted to offer you a global view, and Europe is not in all cases the best in class, but when it comes to beneficial ownership, it's actually a forerunner. And if I look at other countries in my membership, we are now catching up with our rules to the European standard when it comes to transparency registries, right? So I think that is something we should have in mind. So I think there are still room for improvement. But what I wanted to point out is one word that the colleague from Europol said, and that is interlinkage of registries. Why actually do we need a global solution? It is because the professional money launderers use multi-layer company structures that go cross-border. So if I want to find out about the ultimate beneficial owner of a company that sits somewhere in Europe, it crosses the border to some offshore jurisdiction, and it ends after 10 countries somewhere in the world. But I cannot find out because they may not have a registry and they are not connected. So in Europe, we started step by step. I think it was with the 4th Money Laundering Directive that we introduced the obligation for registries, and with the 5th Money Laundering Directive, we require the interconnectedness of these registries so that you can look cross-border. And now with implementing in FATF a global solution, offers at least the possibility in some distant future to interconnect these registries so that you really have a global span transparency of beneficial owners. I think that is what we should strive for. And very shortly, you talked about this banking account registry. There is a directive of the European Union that I think was enforced a year ago. So it's called a Financial Information or Intelligence Directive that already requires such a registry in Europe. It's not very famous because it's not called the 5th or 6th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, but it actually belongs also to the field of AML.
Merci beaucoup. Et aussi un point important.
Thank you very much. One other important point is that the registered should be public where possible, so that they can be consulted beyond the borders of Europe, but from other countries as well. Perhaps we could move on to another topic related to traceability now, and that is the use of new technologies which offer more financial inclusion, but which could also be useful in fighting combat terrorist funding and money laundering. They were touched upon in the Security Council's Resolution 2462. Paul, I'd like to begin with you about the mobile finance services that your company, Orange Mobile, or Orange Money, offer. How does your group, Orange Money, make sure that the onboarding procedures comply with AML and CFT requirements? Do you think that Europe will be able to harmonize these rules and procedures? Well, thank you very much, Delphine, for the question and for organizing this panel. So we're present in Europe and Africa, yes, as well. We have 50 million customers in Africa, 2 million in Europe, so far more in Africa, and slightly different services that we offer. We see three areas where progress could be made. First of all, the difference between what technology can do and what lawmakers allow in the fight against money laundering. Now, I began my career 25 years ago, and where a back office worker had seen that there was a case of fraud because the paper wasn't of the same quality, the paper wasn't the same thickness as usual, and they said, look, I think this is fraud. That's what was happening 25 years ago. Now, today, at Orange, we think that one way to check a customer's identity is to face match them, as we call it. That means we ask them to take a photo of their ID card and then take a selfie in a video, not just as a photo. And then we have AI tools that compare the selfie film and the ID photo. And when that works, the risk of fraud through identity theft is also almost zero. What we're also seeing in Europe is that this is possible in some countries, and in others you have to have a physical person to check what AI has come up with by way of result. So you have this disparity between what technology can do and what lawmakers allow. In some places you would ask for proof of residence, which even my son could fake on Photoshop if he wanted to. So that's the first thing. Next is the issue of the level playing field in Europe. We have European passporting, which is a good thing, but it means that you can run a bank from the Baltic countries, from Germany, from Spain, and offer that to customers in any European country without having a physical presence in those countries. That's European passporting. That's a good thing for Europeans. But what it means is that in a given country like France, you can have banks from other countries, and they will be subject to the rules of their home country rather than host country rules. So you'll be looking at a bank in France working with anti-money laundering rules from France, and then other banks using anti-money laundering rules from other countries. So the onboarding rules would be different in one country to another. But in the digital world, if you change your onboarding setup like that, you could lose 10% of your customers, and so that would be particularly unfair. If we had harmonization of what we see as an electronic ID or not, then that issue would be settled. And thirdly, again relates to the level playing field, and this is the level between the small and big players. We've got 2 million customers in Europe, so we're a small player. When we have stolen identities or falsified identifiers, we need to be able to see whether that's the case. But whether you have a big player with 10 million IDs, and they have access to a database of stolen identities, so they can tell whether or not something's stolen or not. They can then identify the fraudsters, and that's why fraudsters will go through smaller companies that don't yet have a database of stolen identities or haven't had the time to set one up. If we had a central database of stolen or forged IDs, then we would be able to reduce that risk. Obviously, the big players wouldn't be very happy about that because the database is, if you like, a barrier to entry into the market at the moment. Thank you. Marcus, perhaps let me come back to you. New technology offers great opportunities, offer new tools for the fight against financial crime, but they also bring with them risks. How does the FATF deal with that dichotomy?
So in the past, the FATF has concentrated on monitoring the risks. And one result is that the FATF has been the first international institution to set standards in the area of virtual assets, the topic of the former panel, and which created the travel rule and all these things that we now see being implemented in the jurisdictions. And this will continue, that's clear, monitoring the risks. But when I started my presidency 1.5 years ago, one of the first projects was to look also into the opportunities of digital transformation, and there is a lot with the artificial intelligence and machine learning. You can speed up your know your customer data. You can really reduce the time that the compliance people spend with false positives, so that they have time to really look in the important issues. There is one project, a second project, that might be even more important, and that comes back to a question that Nicolas Véran asked this morning to the Home Affairs Commissioner, and that is about the balance between effective AML and data protection. And you may be aware of that. I think I don't think they exclude each other, and they can be achieved very well by using digital technologies to make AML effective by information sharing, and this is what you just talked about, and at the same time uphold a high level of data protection. So there is this encryption technology, privacy enhancing technology. There are migrating algorithms that look first in this database, and then they go to another bank and look in that database, and then they look whether there are some hits. So without a human being searching through mass data and violate data protection. So this is something we are looking at, and we are also, by the way, the first international institution that gave a guidance for digital IDs, which I think very much helped, especially in the times of COVID. And I completely agree, in the end, this can be even much secure, much safer than the traditional face-to-face identification. So this is very much in the focus of the FATF, the opportunities and the risks.
Thank you. Just to elaborate on that, will Orange Money and mobile phones, you talked about the number of users you have in Africa. It's a huge market, but it's one that does bring with it a certain number of risks. given the number of transactions. There is a cap, but there's an enormous number. How does a group like Orange Money then mitigate the risk of laundering, given that ID documents are not always either provided or particularly reliable? Well, of course, this is a huge issue for us. We have 50 million customers with 60 billion euro of transactions a year, and the average is 20 euro per transaction. It's peer-to-peer and domestically, so Senegal to Senegal, or is 85% of our transactions. We do have a problem with ID, because ID cards in Africa are not terribly widespread, and sometimes the validity of an ID card will be extended beyond its expiry date. And you have countries like Mali where people have the same name and or the same first name. What we'd like to see happen, well, let me tell you first of all how we deal with this, then I'll say what we'd like to see. So we take a risk-based approach where there are people who are not carrying out very many transactions or small amounts, 10, 20, 50 euro, we'll take a minimum of information, no ID, but we might take a phone bill or perhaps a witness saying that you are who you say you are. And then we'll allow a small number of transactions. And over that number of transactions, we'll ask for an ID and what have you, and then so on. And that's fairly reasonable, because 20 euro, you can't fund much terrorism. Now, what we'd like to see is more technology. So, for example, biometrics. We've tested it. It works very well. With very simple devices worth no more than 100 euro, you can ID people biometrically. That has to be allowed by the governments of countries. It has a cost, of course. On 20 euro, it might cost a few centimes. We need to reduce the cost of biometrics, but that's possible. Let's give you another example. We often make small loans. Sometimes here there is fraud. I hope it's not funding terrorism, but we can identify certain types of behavior. For example, people in Africa will have several SIM cards. One SIM card for financial transactions, and then they'll stop using it and use a different one for a period. How do you notice it's the same person? Well, you can check the name, but obviously a lot of people have the same names, as I've said. Then there's geolocation. And if you have two SIM cards with the same name and in the same place all the time, they're probably in the same phone. And that would make it possible to identify certain types of behavior. Now, the regulator doesn't recognize that, but we can use it as a tool. So yes to inclusion. In Africa, regulators are very pragmatic, perhaps more so than in Europe, and they allow this risk-based approach so that we can progressively introduce technology so that we can bring down the cost of checking per transaction. So this goes for users that have a phone or a bank account, or at least a phone number. This is not going to work for occasional customers who buy prepaid card phones.
Le marché africain, c'est un marché qui est essentiellement prépayé.
Well, the African market is mostly made up of prepaid cards. It's not postpaid, i.e. people on contracts like it is in Europe. Mostly people in Africa are consuming by the minute, and they buy extra minutes when they need them. So it's mostly prepaid. We are a telecoms operator. Now we have a small amount of information about customers, but basically we know they've got a phone number. Now we have low-cost actors, mostly US, entering the market now, which are not using the phone number, but they're using the internet connection of the phone. And the risk there is of not understanding of the customer, knowing who the customer is much higher. Our requirement is to have as a minimum, a phone number associated with a customer. Whereas you have an OTT or over-the-top system without a phone number, and we've made this point to the local authorities, the risk of the customer remaining anonymous is much higher, the risk of volatility is much higher, and there's another level playing field issue with regard between us and the internet-only actors. Now, the other point concerns technology. I have a smartphone, but a lot of 80% of people in Africa are not using smartphones. So if you're talking about only smartphones, you're only talking to 20-25% of the African population. Thank you. Maybe the one last question for you, Burkhard, just to make the link between cooperation between enforcement agencies and the private sector in the context of coordination mechanisms, which could be helpful in detecting certain types of fraudulent transactions. Maybe you could perhaps describe what kind of mechanisms you've looked at, which exist within member states, and which could, or in your view, should be used more widely through the legislative package.
Well, we have at Europol a project that is called Europol Financial Intelligence Private Partnership Project. And this is highly effective, and it brings together experts from the law enforcement area. FIUs are taking part, and the financial sector is represented as well. And in this cooperation, we deal with various issues, including transparency of financial transactions, of course. And by discussing the topics with the industry and the public sector and the law enforcement sector, we learn about new trends, identify typologies, and we have various topics. Recently, we discussed virtual assets, also terrorism, financing-related topics, and that information is then provided in the form of reports that is accessible to all the participants in this working format. And the results are really very promising, and it can be used in the daily practice for the industry to see the risks, have the actual trends that law enforcement observes, and vice versa. And this is something we would like to continue and even increase. It does not include the exchange of personal data, which is legally not possible, but we have an exchange on a strategic level that is indeed very helpful as well.
So that's at Europol level. What about the level of the member states as regards the various coordination mechanisms to work with the private sector? Do you assist member states in exploring the different types of mechanisms there may be for information exchange?
We have, of course, constant interaction with the member states, and we provide assistance also if they need to identify somebody from the private sector where the member state doesn't have any actual contact. We facilitate the contact and support in that form. But we are not involved in this cooperation at national level. But we assist as far as possible on a European level. And we, for example, what we do is we have an innovation hub at Europol that is looking into technical solutions that can support criminal investigations. And of course, the member states are taking part and bring in their expertise, and we share them then at European level.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this panel discussion. It's a very broad field, transparency of financial transactions. Thank you all for your insights. I think you've helped us identify some of the potential further avenues of inquiry where extra work can be done. And we've seen that major progress has been made within the EU. and indeed that the EU is in many ways at the forefront in the lead of a number of countries at international level. Various other countries have got plenty to learn from the EU, we can see. Thank you very much for giving us this international insight into this range of issues. And now I'm going to pass the floor on to the organisers for the closing session of today's event. Thank you very much all. Thank you for being with us, and see you all again.
Bien, mesdames et
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you, first of all, to all participants, panelists, and those who've been with us throughout the day. I know some of you have trains, planes, and other things to catch. It is Friday evening, and so I shall be brief in concluding today's conference. But I did want to thank the Ministry of Finance, the Economy and the Recovery, the various departments thereof, and in particular my own, that's to say the Director General for the Treasury for organising today's conference, plus all the other units which have contributed and made today a success. That's to say this conference on combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Just to summarise some of the key points made throughout today. It's been a very full day, but we first heard from commissioners and ministers reminding us to what extent the EU is a driver of the fight against financial crime, which knows no borders, and the extent to which the EU, in the shape of the new legislative package presented by the Commission, wishes to lead by example still further. Then the first panel, looking at anti-money laundering rules, showed that private sector actors expect harmonisation, demand harmonisation from across Europe in terms of declaration and reporting of suspect financial transactions and recording of customer data. And we all want harmonisation of rules across Europe. So the introduction of a ceiling, a limit for cash payments, will be debated over the next few months. We know that there are some very firm positions on this subject. The second panel discussion on AMLA, I think, gave us an insight into some of the major challenges and issues surrounding the creation of this new anti-money laundering agency. Supervision needs to focus on the most at-risk entities, not necessarily the biggest, in terms of size, that is. Supervision needs to look at financial actors, of course, but also crypto assets. AMLA needs to have a governance structure which enables it to take tough decisions and be a governance which is independent, in the interest of the EU. It also needs to have adequate resources and an adequate budget in order for it to be able to complete the ambitious tasks it's been set. As the French Presidency, we consider the text creating AMLA will be one of the priorities of our presidency of the European Council. During the afternoon, we then had a discussion between experts from across Europe and beyond in the law, in finance and other areas, looking at how cooperation in Europe between different public bodies, but also between public and private sectors, and how crucial that is in dismantling criminal networks and detecting criminal activity. You also discussed the risks associated with crypto assets. This is the kind of thing which makes the front pages of the newspapers and is as much debated in the United States as it is in Russia. And so it was the subject of a very detailed discussion, in particular the need for an appropriate and proportionate anti-money laundering legal framework in the light of the emergence of, in many cases, virtuous actors in Europe and elsewhere in this virgin territory of decentralized finance. So we need to crack down on money laundering and financing of terrorism and other illegal activities, but without hindering innovation. And then in the final panel discussion, we saw how Europe can again lead and be a driver of financial transparency, cracking down on shell companies and opacity in all its forms. There's been a whole agenda focusing on combating this shadow finance, the use of AI and other data pooling and other technological innovations which allow us to be more effective when we act together. All of this is extremely helpful for all of us, in particular for the French Presidency of the EU, as we rework and revise the EU's legal framework in this area. With the creation of the new agency, we will have it will change fundamentally the landscape. It will allow both financial and non-financial stakeholders to modify the way they work, working with the European institutions, but it will also offer private sector actors a new framework for supervision with potential gains in terms of harmonization and more common practice for the legislators, and in particular in the context of the French presidency. We think that the contributions made today are valuable and will help us find the right balance during our negotiations. That is to say, being both ambitious but also proportionate, taking account of the diversity of the private sector, financial and non-financial, the different levels of exposure to risk of money laundering and terrorist financing, the need for privacy and protection of personal data, the potential also of new technologies, as well as catering for and understanding and indeed controlling the emergence of new risks. We look forward to a lively debate, which will resume at the Council level as of next Monday on this ambitious legislative package. So you have 2 days respite over the weekend before resuming negotiations on the draft legislation. The package remains a priority for us, given its level of ambition and its innovative nature. And so we hope that the European package of legislation will be more effective and benefit the internal market, boost security for our fellow citizens, and offer the EU greater autonomy. And therefore, it very much summarises the spirit in which we're conducting our French presidency, that is to say, to be ambitious in our aims, but also achieve tangible results for our fellow citizens. Thank you very much, and good evening.